Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Plants and Pollinators. My name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and tonight I'm joined by Rebecca Golden. Hey, Rebecca, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, looking forward to Plants and Pollinators again. So tonight's presentation, we are going to be talking about different native plants that you can be putting in your yards and in your spaces that can help support pollinators throughout our area. Just to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get going here. We are, as many of you heard, recording tonight's presentation. We will be uploading it onto our YouTube channel following the event. And I will be sending out a link to that recording. So if you do have to step away for any reason, or if you want to go back and rewatch anything, you will have a version or a link to the recording of tonight's presentation. So don't feel like you have to take in-depth notes. You will be able to see everything. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email containing that link, as well as a copy of the presentation slides. So you will see these slides firsthand, and we'll also include any links to resources that we discuss this evening. At the very end of tonight's presentation, you will get a little pop-up window that will ask you to take a short survey. If you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to complete that survey, it is a big help in helping us develop these webinars and workshops and be able to continue to bring them to everyone in the community. Just to go over the format for this evening, I'm going to be doing a brief introduction to soil and water conservation districts, particularly the Tualatin SWCD. And then Rebecca and I are actually going to be co-presenting and going back and forth talking about some of the different materials that we'll be seeing tonight. At the very end, we will have time for a Q&A. So at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. If you do have any questions along the way, please feel free just to put them in that Q&A. And then at the very end, we'll go back and we'll cover each and every question that you all have. I'll also be monitoring the chat. So if you do have anything that comes up, please feel free just to include that. And I will respond to it as soon as I'm able to. All right, Rebecca, you want to switch over the slide for me? Awesome. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. The Tualatin SWCD is a non-regulatory government agency that works with our community to implement conservation actions to better protect our natural resources. Those natural resources include our soil, our water, our air, and many of the wildlife and pollinators and other beneficial insects that you might see along the way. Now, we were one of 45 SWCDs in the state of Oregon. We've been around since 1955, and our service area is in Washington County, which is just west of the Portland metro area. Now, we help our community conserve natural resources in a couple of different ways. We do that through technical assistance, so we offer advice. We go out on site visits, so if you do live in Washington County and you want to have an expert walk your location with you, we have staff members that are more than wanting and willing to do that. We also help protect our natural resources through financial assistance. We have grant programs. We also have direct financial assistance programs that can fund qualifying projects on community spaces throughout Washington County. And we do that through education, and we also support our community through education programs like tonight's presentation. Now, if you don't live in Washington County, I do suggest you look up your own SWCD. There's one in just about every county across the United States. Now, this illustration shows what our watershed looks like. This is the Tualatin River watershed, and this encompasses most of Washington County. As you're looking at the illustration, you can see that our community is formed in a little bowl or a basin, and that's by the mountain ranges, the hills that surround it. Now, what that does is that creates that basin that any water that falls on it or runs underneath it is all connected, and it connects through these waterways that you see. In Washington County, our main source of water is the Tualatin River. It's the only river that exists within our county, and it flows from the west part of the county all the way through the county itself. And throughout that, it touches a wide variety of areas. In Washington County, we have forested areas, which make up about 50% of the county, rural areas, which is about 35%, and also urban areas, which is about 15% of our county. But that water touches everything. And so we like to say that we work on a watershed level because we work anywhere in the county that water touches. Next slide. Now, how do pollinators fit in? That's a really great question. Pollinators are essential for native plants to thrive, and native plants are an indicator species of a healthy watershed. Pollinators and especially native pollinators have evolved with the native plants in our region through millennia, and they help them thrive. These native plants, they're adapted to the climate that we're in here, so they can thrive in the conditions that are present. They have a deep root systems, so they go further into the ground than invasive plant species, and that allows them to hold on to soil so that we don't have instances of erosion in our community. They also provide better habitat for wildlife, so we can have a larger biodiversity of wildlife if we have a larger biodiversity of native plants. And they also don't need any pesticides or as many fertilizers, which often can lead to pollution in our waterways and in those river areas that you've seen in that last slide. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, and we can talk a little bit more about how pollinators fit into our ecosystems.
Awesome. So as Andrew said, our native plant system and about 90% of all flowering plants or angiosperms in the world do require an animal pollinator. And so a pollinator is just a biotic factor that will transfer the male gamete or the male genetic material of the plant, which is contained in its pollen, to the female part of another plant of the same species. And so that allows the egg to become fertilized and for that embryo to turn into a seed. And so a seed is an embryo of a plant, and they're basically allowing the continued propagation and sexual reproduction of plants themselves because they can't get up and walk over to each other. And so any animal that does this is a pollinator and can provide those pollination services. And of those, most pollinators are insects that are deliberately visiting flowers to gather some sort of resources for themselves. And those might be flies or beetles or butterflies, wasps, or bees. And other animals do these or provide this service as well. Sometimes it is a little bit less deliberate. Frogs don't generally gather resources from flowers and may not be on flowers very often, but every now and then might seek refuge or shelter on a flower and may in fact transfer some pollen around and provide pollination services. Some other vertebrates like hummingbirds are specifically pollinators because they're gathering nectar from flowers and transferring pollen. And there are lots of bats in the American Southwest that provide pollination services as well. All of the bat species we have in the Pacific Northwest aren't pollinators, but they do provide a lot of other really great ecosystem services to our areas, a lot of times as biocontrol agents, predators that are keeping prey species like mosquitoes and things at bay. And people can also be pollinators. So this is a date palm. So all dates are hand pollinated by people. Date palms are not native to North America, and so all of the date producers in California do require human pollinators to come. And so they have these strings that have almost like cotton ball attachments to them that they'll loop and run up the bunch of flowers in order to pollinate them and produce those dates. So tonight we'll talk a lot about many different types of pollinators, the ones that are active at different parts of the season and the different types of flowers that they will visit and the types of pollinating services that they'll provide. The ecosystem is it contains many, many native pollinators or bees and other insects that evolved here and have a close relationship with the native plants that we have in the Pacific Northwest as well and in Oregon. But there are also many introduced species, particularly introduced insect species that will also be visiting flowers and providing some pollinating services in our Pacific Northwest ecosystems as well. So generally, in North America, you have a geographic barrier of the Rockies that will keep species to the east and species to the west from intermingling too much. But as humans, we have moved things around. We, deliberately brought honeybees over the mountains in the 1800s. So it wasn't actually until the 1800s with Mormon settlers that honeybees made it over the Rockies and into our Pacific Northwest ecosystems. But we also have introduced many other species to provide pollination services, usually for specific agricultural products. Something to keep in mind when we're talking about non-native pollinators or insects that have been introduced, in particular like honeybees, they do also pollinate non-native plants or invasive plants in a lot of cases. And so this is garlic mustard. This is actually off the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District website. But honeybees gather a ton of nectar and pollen from garlic mustard and are increasing the spread of those invasive plants. And so when we're talking about supporting pollinators that we have here, generally the ones we're trying to conserve and provide more habitat for are native species that are only visiting native plants. However, there are negative impacts or certain ramifications from introducing non-native bees and in particular honeybees into ecosystems. And so that's something to consider if you do have a honeybee hive or if that's something you are looking into. There are plenty of reasons to keep honeybees. Most of them are cultural. And, I like to think of it more like keeping chickens than doing anything that's necessarily a conservation practice. And so for the purposes of tonight's presentation, we'll be focusing predominantly on native bees and other native pollinating invertebrates. So in order to get bees to the plant and for them to start providing those pollinating services, flowers have to be very, very attractive. And so the flower of the plant itself can be kind of thought of as the beacon or the signal to the pollinator. And so in the case of bees and wasps, they may be looking for nectar, which is a carbohydrate or their sugar source. And in the case of bees, they're specifically looking to gather pollen as a protein source for their young. And they'll usually carry that on external features on their bodies, like long hairs or scopy, like this bee here. And generally, they're a lot messier of insect visitors than other species. So this wasp may also be moving some pollen around as it's going from flower to flower, but you could tell there's quite a difference between the amount of pollen this wasp is carrying just as a kind of byproduct of it gathering nectar as compared to this bee that is just completely covered in what looks almost like Cheeto dust. She went face first into the nectar reservoir in that flower. And so those flowers are specifically sending out visual cues that might be color or scent or shape, and they're trying to tell their pollinator what is there for them and trying to get them to come to move its pollen around, transfer its pollen, and provide a pollination service. Okay. Other things bees and other insects might be gathering from their environments would be nesting materials. And so most bees are solitary bees that nest in hollow cavities or in woody stems or in holes or tunnels that they dig in the ground. But generally, they'll need to line their nest cavities with some other sort of natural material. Some bees will actually secrete waxy-like substance that will seal their tubes themselves. But Other bees and other insects might be gathering things like resins from plants. So I think this is probably predominantly cottonwood resins that this resin bee was able to line its nest with and keep everything stable and together. These are little leaf cuttings in a leaf cutter bee tube that she's used to block up holes so that predators and things aren't able to get in. And then her larvae will actually incorporate bits of those little leaf pieces into their cocoons when they pupate. This is a wool carder bee that's scraping the kind of cottony material off of a lamb's ear. And then here we have a really interesting bee. So we don't have any orchid bees in the Pacific Northwest, but this is an orchid bee in the American Southwest that is gathering fragrant oils that he'll use to attract female mates. And so bees and insects gather tons and tons of resources from plants. Here we have honeybees that are gathering water, and they might, use plants as a refuge or land on the plant in order to sip the water. There are tons and tons of things that they will be attracted to in the plant kingdom. Another thing to keep in mind is host plants. And so butterflies and moths, or the insects in the order Lepidoptera, do provide some pollination services to specific types of plants, but they also require having a food source for their caterpillars or their larvae. And so these host plants are generally something that has a little bit of a toxin in it that will prevent those caterpillars from being eaten by predators. And the female will be attracted to it. She'll land on it. Generally, a female butterfly that's trying to lay eggs will look for a really good quality plant, or one that has growing stems or growing shoots on it. And so she'll crawl on that plant. She'll taste it a little bit with her front legs to make sure it's fresh enough for her young. She'll lay eggs on the leaves, and those eggs will hatch, and the caterpillars will eat the plant itself before they pupate. Whereas bees spend all of their kind of larval or their developmental times inside of their nest, whether that's, in a stem or in a tube or in the ground, you don't see the larvae very often, and all of the resources that they require are provided by their mothers inside of that nest. Whereas butterflies and moths have a little bit more of a hands-off parenting approach. And so, she lays those eggs, she finds a good plant for them, and that's about it. And so from then on, those caterpillars are really on their own. And hopefully they just have enough food source, or they have enough area of that host plant in order to grow fat enough to pupate. And so here's a handful of some of the common butterflies that we have in Oregon, and then their host plants. So one I should point out is the monarch butterfly. So we have Western monarchs in Oregon, maybe not necessarily in Washington County or in Portland. We don't see them very often during their migration patterns, but there is a Western monarch call to action that you can take part in to help provide milkweeds, which are their host plants, in order to increase the area that they have. Monarchs are getting more attention because the 2021 count of monarchs yielded only about 2,000 individuals, which is a pretty steep decline. There was a pollinator protection plan implemented by the Obama administration in 2015 that wanted to increase that number to 225 million. And so it was way, way off the mark. And so that's a call to action that needs quite a bit of support to keep them from going extinct at this point. But there are lots of other butterfly species that you'll see in Washington County and in the Portland area. And these are their common host plants. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that flowers are like beacons that are trying to attract the best pollinator to get the job done. And so what that has yielded is kind of this balance between pollinator and the plant itself. And what's happened is that plants have evolved specific characteristics that are specifically attracted to or attractive to the type of pollinator they're trying to draw in. So like a butterfly plant, since they have very, very long tongues, might have a very long nectar tube that shorter tongued bees or things might not be able to visit. But a lot of the bees and a lot of the Pacific Northwest native pollinators that we have are what we call generalist foragers that are foraging on a variety of plants. And so this is the same species of yellow-faced bumblebee on many, many, many different types of plants. Something to keep in mind for certain species that have very long periods of time where they're active during the year is to provide a variety of plants that bloom at different stages of the year so that they're covered for the entirety of their active season. While there are some species that will specialize on particular groups of plants, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but really the most important thing is to provide a huge variety of plants that bloom at many different stages of the year. And so here we've got, the most early blooming plants like rosemary are going to be attractive to the bees that are coming out or the insects that are coming out first thing in the season. And then late blooming things like goldenrod are going to be supporting bees and insects that need pollen and nectar much later in the season. And with that, I'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit more about the specific plants at different stages.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. So as Rebecca mentioned, the key really to help support pollinators is to provide plants that bloom throughout the growing season. So for this next section, Rebecca and I are going to trade off and talk a little bit about which plants that you can plant that will bloom during those specific time of years and kind of give you a little highlight of those. And then we'll talk about the specific pollinators that they can support. So first up is our early bloomers. So typically our early bloomers are going to be plants that bloom in early spring. So that's March, April, and May. Now, one of the first plants that blooms is going to be white meadow foam. So white meadow foam is a ground cover, so it stays relatively close to the ground. And as you can see, it has these really vibrant white flowers. It is a great ground cover, not only because of its support of pollinators, but it also helps stop weeds from getting started. Dandelions can often take over into bare areas of soil. And so if you have a plant like white meadow foam that can cover that area, it can stop those plants from really germinating and it can thrive in itself. This plant is it's about a foot tall, so it can stay pretty low to the ground. Now, the best time to plant white meadow foam is actually right now. The fall is a really great time to seed ground cover or spring ground covers like meadow foam, because it takes a cold season to really help germinate those seeds so that they can then establish and grow up when spring comes around. Now, our next plant that we'll talk about is tall Oregon grape. Tall Oregon grape is actually the state plant of Oregon. And if you look at it, you can see it has these really small, vibrant yellow flowers. So it really pops out in the springtime. It's one of the ones that you can always tell when you see. It also has these very shiny leaves. We often like to refer to tall Oregon grape to folks who like the plant. There's a plant, English holly, which is actually an invasive plant for our area because it really can take off and grow very large. Tall Oregon grape, on the other hand, has a similar leaf structure. It has those shiny green leaves that you see there, but it doesn't get quite as tall and doesn't take over many spaces. This plant can get up to be about 5 foot tall or about 5 feet wide, so it can turn into a decent sized shrub. It doesn't lose its leaves, so it keeps its leaves year round. If you like, there's also smaller versions of this plant. Dull Oregon grape is a good one, creeping Oregon grape. All of these species that are in this Mahonia species level can have a similar leaf structure as this. It is a relatively easy plant to grow in our area. and it does actually produce grapes come fall time. If you're looking on any walks, you can actually see some of those Oregon grapes growing right now. You can eat them. They are pretty sour though, so they're not the best eating grapes for humans, but birds certainly love to eat the grapes along the way. Now our next plant that we'll highlight is red flowering currant. This is another plant that is relatively easy to grow. It is a larger deciduous tree or shrub, so it does lose its leaves come the fall time. And it does get quite a bit bigger than tall Oregon grape. This one can get up to be about 10 foot tall. Red flowering currant is one of the best plants that you can plant to help support pollinators in our area. And that's because it's one of our earliest bloomers. These red flowers that you can see, they're actually one of the first flowers to come out in March. And it's always nice if you're out, walking any trails. You can often see these big meadows of red flowering currant flowers really starting to pop up. And it's always it's at least my reminder that, winter is coming to an end. We have our red flowering currant coming. It's a nice one to brighten those late winter days. Now, our next plant that we'll talk about is ocean spray. Ocean spray is a deciduous shrub, so it does lose its leaves, but it also can add a lot of charm to gardens. If you take a look at the flowers here, you can see that they're these little fuzzy balls, and it looks kind of like ocean foam spraying out into a garden, and it just adds that little touch of charm to any garden that you can see. Ocean spray is drought tolerant, so you don't need to add a whole lot of water once it gets established. With any of these plants that we're talking about today, it's always good to help them along for the first couple of years with watering, but once established, you won't have to water them. And that's another reason why it's really great to look into including plants such as this. Yeah. Now, another wide variety of plants that help support pollinators are actually fruit trees. Any variety of fruit tree that you can think of. Fruit trees are some of the earliest blooming trees that can be found in an area. And not only do they provide fruit for us to eat, but they also provide pollen for pollinators to eat as well. No matter the type of fruit tree that you're interested in, whether it's apples, cherries, plums, pears, you name it, any sort of fruit tree is going to bloom early in the season. And so these pollinators, you can really establish a very beneficial relationship within your own space by providing a fruit tree. Not only will those pollinators receive that pollen earlier in the spring, but they'll also help pollinate your fruit so that you can get more produce along the way. And our last spring bloomer is going to be the Oregon white oak. Oregon white oak is a signature species in Oregon. It's one of the icons of the Willamette Valley, and unfortunately, its area and its habitat are being threatened. It's known that it is a threatened species within Oregon. Its numbers are quickly dwindling. Oregon white oak is a majestic tree, as you can see. It can get up to 70 foot tall, and it really provides critical habitat in our region. Oregon white oak is a very slow growing tree. So what we like to say for folks who are considering it is that you're really planting this tree for your grandchildren. So think of it as kind of a present to a future generation. Oaks in general are amazing habitat producers. They actually support the widest breadth of life that's known. They support invertebrates, birds, you name it. Everything can find a little niche of a habitat within an oak tree. So it's one that we always like to point out when we have the chance to.
Okay, and with that, we'll discuss some of the pollinators that start coming out in that March, April, May timeframe, and the ones that will be visiting a lot of the plants that Andrew just discussed. So we'll start with mason bees. So I kind of like to think of mason bees as the harbingers of spring, kind of like that flowering red currant as well. So they'll be some of the first to start flying, even when it's really chilly out. And so they'll start emerging generally when temperatures reach about 55 degrees. And so they are active very, very early. They're even earlier than honeybees. And so they're some of the best pollinators of those early blooming plants, including fruit trees. So if you have fruit trees that you're looking to have pollinated or orchards that need to be pollinated, providing habitat for mason bees is one of the best ways to increase your fruit yield. But this is all bees that are in the genus Osmia. And so there are many, many species, and the ones that are most commonly managed, there are just a handful of those that we kind of know what to do with. So like Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard mason bee are the ones that you'd probably be propagating more, but there are many different species that will be nesting in more natural areas. And so they can be identified by having very, very large mandibles or little pinchers at the fronts of their faces that they use to scoop mud. And so they use mud as their nesting materials. And so they'll line their tube nests with a little mud wall on either side, and that will protect from predators, parasites, and prevent the young from stealing food from one another. But they are generalist foragers, and so they'll visit anything that's blooming at that early stage in the season. They can't really afford to be picky since there isn't that much that's blooming right out of winter, but they'll make great work of a fruit tree that has like a lot of bang for your buck when it comes to blossoms. So as I mentioned, they nest in houses or in tunnels, usually in wild settings that would be like hollowed reeds or pithy stems, like things like caneberries. They might nest in the stems of, but we can provide artificial habitats for them to boost up their populations. As far as conservation status goes for mason bees in particular, most of the managed species are faring quite well these days, and we can provide a lot of artificial habitats for them to increase their ranges. And we're still kind of gathering information about what the entire group looks like in the Pacific Northwest and in Oregon. And so there's the Oregon Bee Atlas that's in progress now, which is all volunteers that are being trained in collecting bee specimens, identifying them, and then they're all being cataloged and put into an Oregon map so that we'll know what species are here, the types of plants that they visit. So they keep information about their host plants, and then their conservation status, so how their populations are changing over time. And so we'll have a much better idea of how these populations are actually faring once we have more information. You might also see mining bees, so they'll come out kind of second. So mason bees are first, and then mining bees are these tiny little small black bees that have dull blonde bands of hair along their abdomens. And then they have these really crazy eyebrows or hairs right in between their eyes that are like bright blonde. And they use those to collect pollen. And then they'll also collect pollen on hairs on the upper parts of their legs here. They nest in usually sandy soil that has ground cover. And so if you have spring ground cover, like Andrew mentioned, that white meadow foam earlier, that can be really, really great habitat for ground nesting bees and like these mining bees. But you can also use things like wild strawberry or things that have kind of that creeping growth. And sometimes they'll like a slope that has good drainage with that sandy soil, and then something that gets a lot of sun in the morning to help warm them up so that they can start flying earlier in the day. So they are also generalist foragers. There are some species that will specialize on a particularly abundant bloom, and that might change from season to season. And so individuals can specialize on whatever is most abundant at that time, so long as there is something that blooms very early in the season and is available for them. And then there are a lot of mining bee species that are vulnerable because of habitat loss. A lot of that in urban and suburban areas is because of turf grass and mulching in between pollinator plants, because they really need that sandy soil exposure that maybe has that ground cover in between in order to nest. And so there are a couple, at least 2 species that have been verified as vulnerable because of habitat loss that are native to the Columbia River area. So those are things to keep in mind when you're planning your habitats, is just making sure you have nesting areas for wildlife as well. You might also start seeing the very, very large queen bumblebees this early in the season, and you will hear them before you see them. So they are very, very large. We're talking, a couple inches and wide. And so they have a lot of hair, wide back legs, and then their color patterns are going to vary between different species. So bumblebees are all in the genus Bombus, and there are many different native bumblebee species that we have here in Oregon. And so they'll have different banding and coloration of hairs that will usually be yellow, black, brown, white, or orange. And the specific segments on their abdomens that are banded are ways that you can start telling them apart. And there are bumblebee identification guides out there that have their segmented abdomens broken down so you can see exactly what those color patternings are between species. But these queens really, really need early blooming plants. So this is kind of a critical time of year for bumblebees because these queens are playing both role as the reproductive individual and the forager. And so they need to be gathering resources and then finding a nesting site to start a colony on their own. And so I think there's about a 90% natural fail rate for hibernated queens or queens that are coming out of hibernation. Hopefully each colony has sent out many, many queens to mate and then hibernate. And so having kind of that high failure rate is just part of the game if you're a bumblebee. But there are things that we can do to increase their success, which provide those really early blooming plants for them. So I know that in cranberry bogs in particular, where they're trying to encourage bumblebees to nest so that they have their natural pollination services, that winter heath is used in order to increase the bloom or what's available to them very early in the season. But things like fruit trees, currant, and Oregon grape are also really great for those bees that are, and generally they're seeking burrows to start their annual social colonies. And so they're attracted to the scent of rodents. And so if you have old rodent bedding that you want to put in nooks and crannies or in places around your yard, you might have bumblebees come nest in your property. So that can be kind of a habitat tip, but often, they'll find brush piles and sometimes they'll find compost piles to make little dens in. There are a lot of bumblebee species that are in decline in Oregon right now, unfortunately. And a lot of that is because of pathogens and diseases that are being vectored by non-native species. And so there are some non-native species of bumblebees that have brought foreign pathogens and agents over the Rockies. And then also honeybees will vector viral loads to bumblebee species as well. And then also bumblebees have gone through a bit of a genetic bottleneck. And so they don't have the genetic variation or the tools in order to react to a changing climate like they need to right now. And of course, habitat loss is something, some of a concern too. So these queen bumbles will need those early blooming plants in order to gather energy resources and food to feed their first little pocket of young. But then also finding a nesting site can be a little bit difficult for them as well, especially a lot of the same concerns like with mining bees having turf grass and mulch and a lot of really well manicured areas that just aren't conducive to their nesting habitat. And beyond bees, you'll start seeing lots of flies come out early in the springtime. And so these will visit a lot of those early blooming plants and provide some really great pollination services. And so this is one group of flies, or hoverflies, that are in the family Syrphidae. And so these flies are actually bee mimics that have the yellow and black striping on their abdomens. And that is just a bit of trickery, or to ward off predators that might think that they could sting them if they try to be or try to eat them. But of course, they don't have stingers. And so it's what we call mimicry, or Batesian mimicry. So these adults will feed on nectar and provide some pollination services, but the really essential service that they provide in the ecosystem is biocontrol. And so they have these free living larvae. The females will lay eggs on plants. Those eggs will hatch, and then the free roaming larvae will eat a lot of things like aphids and pest species that you're trying to prevent in the garden. And so it's really great to encourage these early active flies by providing nectar and blooming plants early in the season, and then they'll return the favor by eating all of the pests in your garden later on. And as far as conservation status goes, they're in pretty good shape. They're pretty cosmopolitan species, and since they don't necessarily nest, as long as they have a food source, they'll be in good shape. Okay.
Great. So those are our spring pollinators. And now we'll move into our summer months. So these are plants and pollinators that are really going to thrive in those hot summer days that we experience in June and July. And here's a preview of some of the ones we'll discuss. Now, the first one is Pacific bleeding heart. Pacific bleeding heart is actually one of my favorite plants because it really brightens up shady areas. I love planting it along fence lines at the bottom because it really can grow up and cover kind of that bottom of the fence and really provide some vibrant color with its blue-green leaves and its really kind of heart-shaped pink flowers. It really brightens up any shady areas that you might have. You can use it as an accent plant, kind of like I do along fence lines, or you can just use it as a general ground cover. It is perennial, so it will start growing in May, June, and then it will die back in the fall. At this point of the season in October, Pacific bleeding heart has pretty much died completely back. But it will come back right up in the next spring or summer. Now, our next one is Oregon Sunshine. This one is, as you can see from the photo, it's really just a cheerful plant. It really looks like a ray of sunshine. Now, what's great about Oregon Sunshine is that it's one of the few plants that does really well, a few native plants that does really well in dry, sunny locations. So if you have a portion of your yard or your space that's far enough from any water source and it's in bright sun, it gets a lot of sun, you consider Oregon Sunshine because it is one that can thrive in those conditions. It is relatively easy to grow. You just kind of plant it in a habitat that it will thrive in, and it will do pretty well for you along the way. It gets to be about 2 foot tall and about 2 foot wide, so a little bit larger than Pacific bleeding heart, but nothing that is completely overpowering in any space or any area. Now, another great plant to consider is common camas. Common camas is a great plant for rain gardens. If you do have a rain garden that's coming off one of your downspouts at your home or your space, common camas is a great plant to consider. It has these purple, blue flowers that you can see that will shoot up and kind of provide this nice kind of plant stock that's going along the way. It does need dry soil during the summertime. So if you are putting it in a rain garden, if you put it on the upper edges that aren't going to be sitting in that water for a long extended period of time, it's going to really thrive in conditions such as that. But it also does pretty well if it does get moist. So rain gardens and kind of the upper section is a good spot to consider. Now, another plant that's great for rain gardens is Douglas Spirea. And Douglas Spirea is another real fun plant. As you can see, it looks like its blooms look like pink cotton candy almost. It looks like you just can kind of pick up that cotton candy as you're looking at it. It is a deciduous shrub, so it does die back each year, so that the leaves will fall off. It does get a little bit bigger, does get up to be about 6 foot, and it actually can thrive in the lower areas of your rain garden. It really prefers to have moist to wet soil. So if you don't have a rain garden and you are considering planting Douglas Spirea, just put it in a location that you know that you're going to be able to water on a regular basis. In terms of alternative plants, we often suggest Douglas Spirea to folks who might have a loosestrife plant, whether that's purple loosestrife or common loosestrife. Those plants typically can be invasive and can harm our natural habitats, whereas Douglas Spirea is one that looks very similar, but it is native to our area. So it is a nice recommendation for folks who have those plants instead. Another shrub that can get a little bit large is going to be mock orange. Mock orange can get up to be about 10 foot tall. So you want to make sure that if you are putting it in a space, that you are giving it enough area to really grow and thrive. The best thing about mock orange is that it is incredibly fragrant. It leaves this big kind of orange scent in the air anywhere that's nearby. So it is a great plant to put nearby if you have a patio or a deck or anything like that. You'll have this constant smell of oranges wafting through the air. So it is a nice plant to be able to incorporate in just about any outdoor space, as long as you have enough room for it. And finally, one of our native trees is a great plant to consider for summer blooms, and that's going to be Cascara. Cascara is one of the more overlooked trees that we have in our region. Most folks, when they think of Oregon, think of a Douglas fir or a cedar, but Cascara is also a really great plant to consider because it really can be adaptable in just about any location. It thrives in dry conditions. It can thrive in moist conditions. It does well in full sun or full shade. It's a really adaptable plant that you can put just about anywhere. It gets to be about 30 foot tall, so it can be rather large. But if you are looking for, a smaller tree that can fit in an urban lot, Cascara is a great one to consider. Now I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca, and we can take a look at some of our summer pollinators that will thrive with those plants.
Great. Awesome. So June and July is really when you're going to be seeing the greatest diversity of insects and pollinating insects, and particularly bees active. And generally they have a lot more options in the summertime. And so this is when you might start seeing species that specialize on particular groups of plants and things like that. So we'll start out with my favorites. These are green metallic sweat bees. And so this is the genus Agapostemon. And there are many species, but they're all characterized by having these bright and green shiny head and thorax. So those first two segments. And then their back half is yellow and black striped usually. And so these sweat bees will generally have short and thin yellow legs, but really that bright green metallic head and thorax are like the dead giveaway of what you're looking at. And so these are short-tongued bees that forage on many different types of flowers that have those shallower nectaries. And so they're not going to be really able to access nectar in plants that have those deeper reservoirs. But a lot of the blooming plants that we have in the summer are conducive to these short-tongued bees. As far as nesting goes, these are also solitary ground nesters. And so they'll find slopes on banks usually. And so on riverbanks are really well populated by green metallic sweat bees, and they'll generally nest in aggregations. And so you'll find many of them all kind of nesting in the same area. And sometimes they'll even share the same entrance. And then they'll have tunnels that branch off into their own individual little nests. And so they have some some social behaviors in those senses. They're sharing responsibilities of defending their entrance to their nests, and they may even so sweat bees that might be sisters to one another or that emerge from the same nest that year may share in some of the brood care, and so they may cooperate a little bit to raise their young together. And as far as conservation status for these green metallic sweat bees, we are still trying to figure out how many different species of this genus we have here in Oregon. And so there's still a lot more information that we need, and volunteers are busy gathering really any green metallic sweat bee they could find during these summer months when they're active. And they can be very, very difficult to tell apart. And so having the actual specimen to run DNA analyses on is really important for telling apart these green metallic sweat bees, and then which species we have in Oregon and how they're changing over time. But then there are other types of sweat bees as well. And so this is the largest group of sweat bees. So these are all in the genus Halictus. And so these are going to be a little bit more robust looking. So where these green metallic ones are much more striking, they have those very thin bodies, whereas these ones are a little bit more stockier, a little more robust, and they have these wide heads. And generally, they're going to have very pale bands of almost blonde hair on dark abdomens, but then they'll also have wider legs, and they'll start gathering or they'll gather pollen on hairs that they have on their legs. And so they dry pack. They don't have quite the same pollen pants as like a bumblebee or a honeybee, where they're really carrying like boulders of wet pollen in their back legs, but they will gather most of those in structures just right on that top joint. So these are generalist foragers. They'll visit a whole variety of summer blooms, but they are utilized and they're very important pollinators of melons. And so providing habitat for these sweat bees, and particularly nesting habitat, if you can get them, they'll in melon fields, they'll provide some of those really great pollination services during their blooms in the summer. And so these will also nest in the ground, kind of similar to the green metallic sweat bees, but rather than being on banks or areas that get more drainage, they'll tend to nest in very flat, sandy soil. And these bees, so they don't gather nesting materials from their environments to line their nests. They actually secrete a wax or kind of almost a polyester resin out of their Doerfer's gland, which is kind of at the back, kind of toward where their stinger is. And that'll seal off nest tunnels and protect it from seepage and from water. And so they don't need quite as much drainage in their nesting sites, and that's why they can nest on those flat areas and take advantage of those spots for nesting. For conservation, there are two species that we know are critically threatened in Oregon, and a lot of that is because of urbanization. So turf grass and mulching, once again, are kind of taking up their nesting habitat. And so being able to leave flat open spaces that get a lot of sunlight is really important to them, but that's not always something that is very easy to provide, particularly if you're being very active in your yards. It almost seems like a waste of space if you have just like an open spot that gets sun that you can't walk on and that you can't put grass in. But they really do need that in order to nest. Okay, and these are the summer counterparts to mason bees. And so these leaf cutting bees are all in the family Megachilidae, and they nest in holes or tunnels. So they're secondary tunnel nesters, we call them, that would find, a similar situation like a mason bee. So like hollowed stems in the wild, or woodpecker holes, or holes in dead wood that were bored by beetles. But we can create artificial habitats for these leaf cutting bees as well, or have these kind of bee boxes or bee houses that will provide nesting habitat for them. And so similar to mason bees, they have that kind of hallmark large mandible, but rather than scooping mud for their nesting material, they are cutting little semicircles out of soft leaves. And so providing nectar and pollen is important for leaf cutting bees, but then also plants that will provide their nesting materials is also very important. And so they'll find soft leaves on like peas, or they like the ones that are kind of waxy almost. And so things like berry leaves or like Oregon grape are all really good options for their nesting materials. So we utilize leaf cutting bees for pollination services quite a bit, like in alfalfa, which is important for cattle and cattle feed. But then a kind of interesting thing happened with leaf cutting bees in Oregon, where all of the alfalfa that was being produced all the way up until about 1950 was pollinated entirely to produce seed, was pollinated entirely by wild bees. And so they have usually these smaller fields that they would let go to seed, and then wild bees would be responsible for a lot of their pollination. And so once they started increasing the size of alfalfa fields, they started seeing a decline in seed set, because they didn't have as many pollinators that could live in those larger spaces. They didn't have as much nesting habitat. And so the farmers started bringing in honeybees to provide pollination services, but then honeybees weren't actually able to trip the mechanism of an alfalfa flower in order to provide pollination to them. Alfalfa flowers have this really interesting anther that once you press through it, it trips and then it taps the bee on the back. Whereas honeybees didn't much like being whacked on the back by the alfalfa flower anther. And so they'd find ways to kind of scooch around it. Whereas these more robust, or these larger bodied leaf cutting bees did the trick. And so now they're maintained in these alfalfa fields and in these huge like bee boards, and a lot of times they're styrofoam that just have like drilled holes in them. And so they are very well managed at this point as pollinating species. However, that's usually just a handful of species that they're propagating a lot, and a lot of the more wild species of leaf cutting bees are actually being outcompeted by invasive leaf cutting bees. And then a lot of the introduced leaf cutting bees will pollinate invasive plants. And so in particular, that yellow star thistle is pollinated by a particular type of leaf cutting bee that was introduced as an agricultural pollinator. Okay. So worker bumblebees are going to be active during the summer. So the queens at this point have already found their nesting sites. They've started making daughters. Those daughters are going to then take over all of the foraging jobs so that the queen can stay inside and just lay eggs for the rest of the season. And so those worker bees are generalist foragers. They'll find anything. They have long tongues and wide bodies and can gather nectar and pollen from a very, very wide variety of plants. They just need a lot of blooms and over that entire summer season. And I won't repeat the conservation status like I did with the queens earlier, but again, yeah, we're seeing a lot of declines in bumblebee species for various reasons. Okay, and then we had syrphid flies as our bee mimic last time, and now we've got Bflies. And so this is the bombyliid bees, or sorry, bombyliid flies that are very round and very furry. And they've got these great big eyes that almost touch in the centers of their head and tiny little antennae that barely poke out in between. But these are really great long-tongued pollinators. And so they'll nectar feed, and then their larvae will actually become parasitoids. So they'll lay their eggs on plants that are infested by certain types of beetles. And sometimes they'll be parasitoids on certain wasps. Like they'll find wasp nests and lay their eggs in there, and their larvae will hatch and then consume the wasp species. And so they do play a role in biocontrol as well as parasitoids of pest species, and a lot of really they don't necessarily specialize on any particular host, but they will find pest species and kind of keep those pest beetle populations at bay. And again, since flies don't really have nesting habitat, so long as these flies have hosts that they can find and food, they aren't threatened by a lot of habitat loss and things that are affecting a lot of other pollinator species. Okay, and then we're going to do just another brief shout out to adult butterflies. We kind of talked about their larvae earlier, their caterpillars needing host plants. But adult butterflies do need to nectar feed as well. And so they have these really long tongues that they keep rolled up at the fronts of their faces, and that they'll unravel to feed, generally from plants that have really deep nectaries, and they'll prefer really sweet smelling flowers that are red or purple. And right now, butterflies really aren't doing so well. They're a little bit more delicate, but a lot of the time their conservation concerns are because of a lack of habitat and a lack of host plants for them to lay eggs on. Okay. And with that, we're going to go back to the plant side of things for the late season.
Absolutely. So in terms of late bloomers, you're looking at plants that bloom in the later months of the summer and going into fall. So late July, August, September, even into October. So it's plants that, you know, if that would have been out and blooming up until a couple of weeks ago, really. Now, one of the first ones we like to talk about is Douglas aster. Douglas aster is a perennial, so it will grow back year after year. And it's a perennial shrub, so it can get to be a decent size, up to, you know, about a foot to 4 feet or so if it's really thriving in a location. Bees absolutely love this late bloomer. This is one of the most active plants that you can find in the late summer. Bees really are just all over these nice, delicate little purple flowers that you see there. Douglas aster spreads by roots, so you can divide it up if you want to share it with any friends. It also can spread very quickly though, so you want to just kind of make sure that you are staying on top of it, and that if you need to, you know, make sure to trim it back. But it is a great plant that you can share with neighbors, with friends, you name it. The next species we'll talk about is Canada goldenrod. This was another one that Rebecca had mentioned earlier that really is a great supporting plant for pollinators in our area. It is a perennial, so it will grow back each year in and out each year. It also is a plant that does really well on a wide variety of conditions. It prefers to be in full sun, but it can do okay in partial shade conditions. It is a plant that doesn't need much water, but it can thrive in just about any location that you put it in. It's one of the last bloomers of the season. So if you want to see some goldenrod still blowing, if you head out, you most likely still are seeing it for the next week or two, give or take. Yeah. And another great late bloomer is yarrow. Yarrow is an incredibly easy plant to grow. It really can thrive in just about any condition that you put it in. It's a great ground cover because it does stay nice and close to the ground. If Rebecca had mentioned earlier that a lot of turf grass is what takes away a lot of habitat for these pollinators, yarrow is a really great plant to consider if you want to look into building an eco lawn, which is a lawn that can better support pollinators within our area. It also has a lot of medical uses for humans as well. You can use it to help heal cuts. You can make teas out of it. it comes in a wide variety of colors and variations that you can find. And as I mentioned, it can grow just about anywhere that you want to put it. And another late bloomer is fireweed. Fireweed is another plant that's easy to grow. Like aster, it can spread pretty quickly though. So you want to just kind of make sure to watch it to make sure it's not totally encroaching in your entire space that you're looking at. One way that you can reduce the space, once fireweed has bloomed and once you see the plants have started to die back, you can just, what's known as deadheading, which is just cut off some of those flowers before it goes to seed, so that it doesn't spread completely throughout an area. It can get nice and tall. It can grow up to 6 feet tall. And like the Douglas Spirea, this is another plant that we'll also recommend for folks if they have a loosestrife, whether that's purple loosestrife, because as you can kind of see here, it has these very vibrant purple flowers, which is one of the attractive features of loosestrifes. This is a really great alternative for that. It prefers sunny conditions, and it can grow in dry soils or even up to moist soils as well. And with that, I think we head back to talk about some of our late season pollinators.
Awesome. So this late part in the season is really when bees start kind of winding down, and there's a lot less there are a lot less blooming plants at this time of year when things are kind of starting to dry out. And so the ones that are active are really taking advantage of any blooms that are available to them. And so these are longhorned bees. These are probably my favorite late season bees because they have these really exaggerated features. And so the males have these incredibly long antennae, and females have these really luscious or long hairs on their back legs that they gather pollen with. They look like leg warmers, and they're just very exaggerated. And so they will generally specialize on things like sunflowers. So some species will really focus on different sunflower species that are growing, while others will focus on asters. That Douglas aster is very, very popular for longhorn bees, and daisies. And so they also nest in the ground. They're solitary bees with just a single female taking care of her own young. And they'll nest on flat ground, kind of similar to those Halictus sweat bees. And they'll also make a waxy secretion to protect water from seeping in to their nests. They're also found usually in dense aggregations. And so if you see a lot of low flying activity of little bees around the ground, you can see that many of them have found a good spot and are all nesting together kind of in the same area. Not much is known about populations of longhorn bees or the exact number of species that we have in Oregon. And so we're still working hard on gathering that information and collecting as many bees late in the season as we can. It's funny because I think the ones we have probably the most information about are the ones that are very early in the season, and then kind of the first ones to start coming out in the summer. And then volunteers tend to kind of drop off a little bit in enthusiasm as you get later in the season. And so we still need a lot more information about these guys. All right. And so this time of year, you may still see bumblebee workers coming out and gathering pollen and nectar. So bumblebees have a really interesting life cycle where they are colony dwelling, but they don't survive all year round like honeybees do. And so at the kind of toward the tail end of the season, they'll start rearing a lot more reproductive individuals. And so they'll have drones and they'll have queens that will then leave the hive, they'll mate, and then those mated queens will burrow underground, or she'll find, a nice pile of leaves somewhere to burrow under, and then she'll hibernate through the winter before coming out in the spring and then trying to strike off on her own. So while it's still warm enough and before that hibernation period, those reproductive queens or those maiden queens still need to be eating. And so they need to find pollen in order to have protein to provision their future eggs, and then nectar in order to keep them going and sugared up until it's cold enough for her to burrow and sleep through the winter. All right. Actually, before I move on from that, I will just say that it's important to have cover or kind of debris in over ground spaces for those queens to burrow into. And so there were lots of deciduous plants that would drop their leaves, or a lot of pollinator plants that will drop their leaves around this time of year. And that can be kind of a great twofer because it is providing ground cover or debris on the ground for hibernating insects before going into winter as well. Okay. And so our fly for this part of the season are our taconid flies. And so these are very large. They have very wide abdomens that are usually kind of brown or almost amber in color, and they'll have these really long wiry hairs that stick off of their thorax and kind of off of their heads by their antennae. And then so one way you can tell flies apart from other insects is that they only have one set of wings. And so they'll fold back, and it's usually just one pair of wings and then long, thin legs. And so the adults feed on both nectar and pollen. And so this is one of the fly species that acts a little bit more like a bee. So it's entirely vegetarian and will eat nectar and pollen, all provided by plants that are blooming later in the season. And generally they're attracted to like stinkier flowers or things that produce a less desirable odor. So like we have sea holly at the farm, and these flies are usually all over that really stinky bloom. And then the larvae are also parasitoid, so kind of like those Bumblebees. These adult females will find a nesting site of their host. She'll lay eggs in it, and then the eggs will hatch, and the larvae will consume their host species. And so they can provide biocontrol as well in the garden, and don't provide any brood care. All it is laying the egg on the host. And then as far as conservation status goes, since they're not nesting, as long as they have host species or host insects and food during the later part of the season, they are in good shape. Okay, and then I wanted to talk about vespid wasps. So these are all European paper wasps, or wasps that are in the family Vespidae. So those include yellow jackets, and generally, yellow jackets and then the European paper wasps that have little orange antennae that have the smaller nests. So yellow jackets will find an underground nesting site, usually a little burrow, and then they'll build a paper structure that has almost like that comb-like structure, like a honeybee. But it's this part in the season when they're really kind of out of control and they're a pest species. And so they'll start becoming a little bit more desperate. There's less food in the environment for them, and they'll start, trying to steal your hamburgers during your barbecues at this later stage in the season. And so they are an introduced species that may or may not be considered invasive. I don't know that anyone has really come out with that bold of a statement at this point for yellow jackets or other vespid wasps, but they do provide a pretty good cleanup crew during some stages in the season, and they're predators of a lot of garden pests. So having them around during a lot of stages isn't all that much of a problem, particularly of the European paper wasps that have orange antennae. They're not quite as much of a nuisance as like yellow jackets that nest underground and have huge colonies. So as far as preventing them in your yards at this stage in the season, it's kind of too late to really do much about it. You just try to attract them to one particular area and keep them away from everything else. If you can use like cat food or tuna. But the best thing to do is to try to catch queens in the springtime before they nest. And so they have a similar nesting strategy or a similar life cycle to those bumblebees. But if you can put pheromone traps up in early spring and catch queens before they nest, that's a good way to knock back their population. And so yellow jacket control really starts much earlier than when they're actually a problem. And so they're a species that you have to prevent more. Okay. All right. And with that.
Great, awesome. So if you have any questions, go ahead and feel free to include those in the Q&A. And I'm going to touch base on a couple of additional resources, and then we'll go ahead and start answering some of the questions. I saw we have some great ones waiting for us. So
Awesome.
So these are two really great native plant guides that we always like to recommend. The native plants for the Willamette Valley Yards is really my go-to resource for native plants. It's a nice handheld book that's very small, very light, and it really details quick descriptions of the plants and some of the different services that they can provide and some of the different wildlife that they can help support. We also really like to recommend the Meadowscaping Handbook. That's put together by another soil and water conservation, the West Multnomah SWCD. Rebecca had mentioned some of the difficulties with turf grass and not being able to support pollinators. One thing that you consider if you wanted to switch over a current turf grass is to make it into a meadowscape, which is really essentially an urban meadow that's full of wildflowers that really can help support many of the pollinators that you've seen today. And I'll include links in that follow-up email to both of these resources so that you can at least look at an electronic version of them. Another program that operates in our area is the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. This is a partnership program that's put on by Portland Audubon and the Columbia Land Trust, and it really is set up to help urban gardeners provide habitats within the spaces that they might have. And those can be spaces big and small, whether that is a small urban lot to a patio that has potted plants to anything in between. It's a program that really helps gardeners understand some of the native plants in our area and really walks them through the steps in transforming their yards to be backyard habitats. If you are interested in the program, we'll also include a link to their website. Once you've signed up to get on the waiting list, they'll actually send out a technician that will walk your yard with you, similar to what our urban technicians will do as well. And they'll talk about what your goals are and help walk through what the planning might be for your space. And once you feel comfortable that you've accomplished what you want to do, you can actually invite them out and get your yard certified. And they certify on these 5 different categories, and more information can be found on their website. Okay, well, and here's our contact information. So with that, let's go ahead and we can start going through the Q&A. So the first question that we got this evening was, how can we focus on specifically native pollinators? It seems like it would be hard to cater only to native insects. How do you go about balancing this with the general decline of bee populations in general?
That's a great question. And so the short answer is you can't really cater it specifically to native pollinators, except by just providing more native plants and doing your best to do invasive species control on a lot of other plant life, and then just providing as many resources that are specifically evolved with our native pollinators as possible. But of course, there are going to be a lot of non-native insect species that will utilize those resources as well. But it's kind of a spaghetti at the wall technique where you're just trying to give them as much of an opportunity as possible. But then, balancing or finding a way to control non-native species is something that can be very difficult when it comes to animals and when it comes to insects in particular. And it requires quite a lot of diligence and a lot of resources from experts. And so that's not something as a hobbyist that's providing pollinator habitat that I would really concern yourself with. It's just about providing a good quality food resource that native insects and native bees can utilize.
Absolutely. Another question that we have that I can take is how far from a structure would an Oregon oak need to be planted? I'd recommend at least 15 to 20 feet for an oak tree. They do get pretty large, and so their root systems can be pretty expansive and can start kind of getting to a structure foundation. So if you are looking at an Oregon white oak, consider it about 15 to 20 feet, and really any large tree you're going to be want to be about that space as well. Another thing to consider too is in our ever-changing climate, wildfire is becoming more and more of a risk. And so you really want to make sure to have about a 10-foot buffer around any structure from vegetation. That just helps cut down on any lateral fuels that you might run into. But particularly for Oregon oak, I would aim for about 15 to 20 feet. All right, another question we have. Can you recommend a pollinator identification guide or book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love Bees in Your Backyard. Is a really great book. I think the author is Wilson, I think, but that is a super great identification guide. Otherwise, there are some. That's probably the one that covers the widest range. Otherwise, the Xerces Society has a book called Attracting Native Pollinators that also has a lot of really great plant resources in it that goes over basic identification guides for a lot of the different groups of bees that we have in North America as well. And then, so I would also look at the Oregon Bee Project website. And so they have a lot of great identification guides. And there is someone at Oregon State Extension that just published a more extensive Oregon guide for identifying bees that goes like into the fine detail. So like how many antennal segments do they have when you get them under a dissecting microscope? That might be of interest to you as well, but I have to remember their name. I can find that information though and share it with you.
Yeah, and I'll also include Rebecca's email on that follow-up email as well. So if you are really interested in that study, please feel free to reach on out to Rebecca, and we can look up to see who had conducted that study.
And I will also mention, if anyone is interested in getting that training, OSU Extension has the Master Melitologist program that's all volunteer run. All of the data goes to the Oregon Bee Atlas. And so if that's something you're interested in working on, I think you can start signing up for 2022 now.
Yeah, and that's a great community science project to be a part of. Another question. So wondering if there's any patio-sized bee boxes available for those of us living in neighborhoods with limited space.
Right. So you can put up bee houses for solitary bees in a patio space, so long as they have all of the resources that they need within about a 300-foot radius, but they'll forage in container gardens, no problem. So if you have blooming herbs early in the season or any kind of ground cover nearby, or neighbors or people over the fence line or kind of public places or public walkways or things like that have a variety of early blooming plants, you can put up a mason bee house. And then the same goes for leaf cutting bee-sized tubes later in the summer. But as far as size goes, I mean, a typical size for a bee house that you might purchase at like a nursery would have maybe 50 nesting holes in it, and could support up to 50 female bees. And that would serve you well in a smaller setting.
Yeah, and that's a ton of hosting areas or nesting areas to be able to provide in a small space. So that's a great option.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, another question. What would your best suggestion be for blooming plants to benefit mason bees that gets full to partial sun on a patio? Great question. I have some ideas, but you want to go first, Rebecca? Or
I would say, I don't know, any blooming herbs that do well in containers. So like rosemary, I think. So I started a red flowering currant in a what's called like a root sack container this season in my backyard. I rent, and so I have all container gardens, and it seems to have done well, at least in its first season, from like kind of a small plant. So I know they get quite a bit larger and generally will need to be put in the ground, but you might be able to utilize that.
Yeah, at least for a good start. Another one, coastal strawberry is another really good one, and that's a nice smaller plant that that you can easily grow in any size container, and you'll get the benefits to be able to have a few strawberries along the way. Another couple that you might look into, if you look into some of the smaller Mahonia species, so those are the Oregon grape species, like creeping Oregon grape. Those plants really only get to be about, about 2 to 3 foot. Actually, even I think you can get them even smaller than that, even closer to about 1 foot by foot. So you can get smaller shrubs that will still really thrive in patios. And it just depends on kind of what that aesthetic, and if you're hoping to, have some of the benefits of the plant themselves, like some of the herbs that Rebecca mentioned, or strawberry, or anything along those lines. That's a great question. Thanks for calling that one specifically out. Another question, should we provide a separate set of nesting boxes and paper tubes for leafcutter bees?
So the nice thing about mason bees and leaf cutting bees is that they have different active seasons. And so you can provide nesting holes or nesting tubes for both mason and leaf cutting bees side by side in the same structure, but they just won't overlap in the times that they're active in. So leaf cutting bees will generally nest in a smaller hole. And so they'll nest anywhere from about 4 millimeters to 6 millimeters, whereas mason bees generally will go for an 8 millimeter size tube. And you can get those nesting tubes specifically for summer bees or for leaf cutting bees from a lot of different producers. And yeah, you can definitely have them side by side with your spring mason bee holes as well.
So a question, do hornet and wasp traps endanger beneficial species?
Right. So the pheromone traps are pretty specifically geared toward yellow jackets. And so those, they won't attract other beneficial invertebrates like they do for the target species, which is why they're so awesome. And it's just so much better than using, a pesticide in general that might affect other non-target organisms.
And this isn't specific to the hornet or wasp, but what about those generic fly traps that you can get? Will those also harm beneficial species, or do they use the same kind of substance and target a specific species?
Yeah, so I don't know if they'd target a specific species. So those more generic fly traps are usually attractive to flies, just in general. And I mean, depending on the abundance of any particular fly that you have around, you may only be trapping like house flies and horse flies, and but that I wouldn't worry about quite as much attracting beneficials, but it might happen.
Okay, so this question actually goes back to one that was asked earlier about setting up patio-sized bee boxes. They were actually more wondering about honeybees in comparison to mason bees. Do you have any recommendations for honeybees in those settings?
I see. So honeybees, that's kind of a whole other ball game, and it's going to be a lot more of a commitment and a lot more of an investment too. And as far as patio size goes, you could have one hive in, a patio-sized yard if you wanted to, but you need to make sure that you have lots of space to work in. So a lot of space to, as you're lifting boxes off, to set them down. And then also, if you have a hive in a patio-sized area, you have to be okay with having a lot of bee activity right there too, because you've got thousands of individuals kind of coming and going. And so if you want to utilize that space for yourself or in other ways, know that, they may be a bit of a nuisance in that way. But I will say, if you are considering working with honeybees, I would definitely start reading and taking classes specifically toward that. And as far as urban areas with like very small yards, it's hard for me to recommend having honeybees in those settings, though people have done it successfully. So it really depends on what you're willing to deal with and what your goals are.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up our questions for this evening. So thank you all again for including them. If you have any questions along the way, as I mentioned, I will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who has registered. So if you have any questions that come to mind later tonight or even further down in a couple of days, please feel free to reach out to Rebecca and myself. We're more than happy to provide any advice that we can, and am happy to recommend. If you are in Washington County and wanted to kind of walk with an expert, we can easily get some of our specialists out there to visit your locations. So thank you again for joining us tonight. Thank you again for presenting, Rebecca. I always pick up something new. I think tonight's was pollinator pants. I just could not stop laughing when I heard that one. That was great. Absolutely.
Maybe a little Halloween inspiration for
there.
you.
There you go. Right. Got to start getting the costumes together. But well, thank you again. And our next pollinator presentation will be in 2 weeks, and it will be a mason bee cocoon harvesting webinar that Rebecca will be also putting together. And more information of that can be found on our website. So thanks again, Rebecca, and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. You too. And thank you all for joining.